Welcome to the Pillow Talk Sessions podcast. My name is Jessica Gillingham and I'm joined by my co-host Kristian Lupinski. Today we're going to be speaking with Brendan Geraghty, who is the CEO of the Association of Rental Living. We're going to be further exploring with Brendan that convergence between hospitality and the build-to-rent sector and getting his view on what's changing.
And it's going to be a great conversation as we'll dive into the shift towards a service and experience model in rental living and the increasing importance of brand experience over physical infrastructure, which has a huge implication for both operators and residents.
We're going to be talking more also about how the build-to-rent sector is attracting a more hospitality service-orientated workforce and what's different between what's happening in the UK compared to what's happening in the US. Brendan, welcome to Pillow Talk Sessions. We're really pleased to have you on the show and to discuss all about how the build-to-rent and the living sectors are converging more and more with hospitality. And I know you're doing lots of really great things around this at the Association of Rental Living. So really, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Jessica, thank you very much for that. I'm very pleased to be here. And I think this convergence, it started and I think it's just going to gain momentum.
Yeah, and welcome, Brendan. And I think before we start today's conversation, maybe you can give us a brief overview of your background and how your journey led you from architecture to becoming the CEO of the Association for Rental Living.
So I think I'll give you the shorter version. I started my architectural career, in fact, as an interior designer. I studied interior design first. And the most important lesson I received in interior design, apart from how to arrange furniture, really was that the difference between interior design and architecture is that interior design is designed from the inside out and architecture is more or less designed from the outside in. So in the latter half of my architectural career, I was heavily involved in designing build-to-rent buildings here in the UK. And what I witnessed was that the rise of the customer experience has been a really, really dominant requirement in the design solution, was just getting more and more important. I call it the rise of interior design, the rise of the customer experience and the understanding of a good solution. I'll be honest with you, when I put this to the market here in the UK, and I certainly put it to my architectural peers, they somewhat thought I was talking, not being as accurate as I could be, shall we say. And but really, I think my predictions of that importance of that customer experience have been borne out now. And at the end of the day, in build to rent, in any living sector, the source of revenue is the resident. And I would summarize the approach is that happy people give you money. If you get them happy, they'll give you money. If you keep them happy, they'll keep giving you money. It's kind of that simple. But how do you do? What is the role of design in that respect? Well, it obviously plays a role. And so from that work in designing buildings, I was asked by what was in the UKAA, because we have a very strong association with the NAA in the States, and then the chief exec retired, and I threw my hat in the ring, and here we are. So that's kind of the potted history. And interesting, I think it's a sort of, I come from a building background looking up, whereas a lot of the influence into the ARL as it is now was from the financial sector and the operating sort of looking down into the building. So I think we've now got a sort of a merger of a bottom up and a top down in the way that we look at the sector.
Thank you, Brendan. It feels like, build to rent being experience-led or service-led, it really was kind of ahead of the curve. Now, with this podcast, we're having quite a few guests that are talking about hospitality and build to rent in the same sentence, and really when we talk about hospitality, and I suppose both Kristian and I come from that world originally. So we're really guest first, resident first is kind of the way that we would always look at it. So now that we're kind of in this sector as well, it's seeing how that is kind of converging and playing out, because it's a lovely idea to say service first, experience first, hospitality first. But how is that convergence playing out in build to rent now?
Well, I think it's gaining momentum. I think those who've been in build to rent for the 10 to 12 years it's been in existence in the UK, they're completely bored in. But obviously, we're very, very early stages of the sector. We're just over 100,000 homes. We want to get up to 2 million. I mean, that's the projection. So there's going to be a lot of people who are coming into the sector. Some of them will be completely inexperienced in build to rent. They may have some experience in residential sales, and others will have experience through hospitality. And of course, we'll get foreign investors coming in, especially from mature markets like the States, who will have a very, very developed understanding. So it's about a cultural shift. It's about a paradigm shift. There's a heavily embedded sales culture in residential real estate in the UK. That is slowly changing as we understand the importance of the role of the customer experience really driving the security of the revenue, and ultimately the residents, the customers, becoming your sales force. So as we've now started to monitor the market, and we have Home Views who do there's a sort of the TripAdvisor of the build to rent sector, and the reports coming back at that, which are consumer focused reports, are very, very, very positive. And the value of a positive customer experience is now starting to be recognized, not just by the consumer, the customer, the resident, but also by the operators who are starting to understand the better they treat the customer, the better experience that the customer has, the more likely it is they're going to stay longer. And a sticky customer, there's less voids, there's less cost and replacement, and overall the sense of community, which I think underpins the build to rent experience, is that really what we're trying to create is community is accelerated. I could go on a little bit about the importance of community, because there's two things that will deliver that community. There is a level of service that is my problems being looked after if I have one, and I can be rest assured that it will be resolved in some shape or form, and that's done variously. And then there's the curatorship within the buildings, which is about encouraging or indeed even hosting interactions that will that support the community position. And the reason community is important is because community is good for business. And if we follow Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is always my go-to place when I don't know how to answer a question, is like, well, what would Maslow say? And once we get past the basics of shelter and so on, and we move into self-actualization at the top of that pyramid, that needs community. That needs people around us who are assisting and supporting us. And I suppose that the difference between us and hospitality is we're a long stay, so that community is not like a holiday community that's quite temporary. It's a long-term community, and for us, long-term would be anything north of a year, but potentially many, many, many years.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I think maybe it is a shift or change, from longer term rentals. I mean, when I was going in long term rentals, I just wanted my place, and there's the door, here's your keys, good luck, thanks landlord, see you later. But do you see that, these kind of hospitality inspired services, they're more expected, or is it one of those still a surprise to people?
I think it's probably a surprise to most. The experience, there's a couple of bits to your question. So there are still those who want that very discreet service that you talked about. Give me my key, leave me alone. And that has to be respected. So I think that's well catered for. If we look at the PRS sector, the private rental sector here in the UK, there's circa 5 million homes. The majority of those homes are mom and pop investors. I mean, there's some big companies in there, but the majority are small time players who maybe have, one to maybe a dozen properties, whatever the case may be. And they're not really professional service providers or property people. This is a sideshow. They see it as an investment or whatever it is. And unfortunately, for a lot of those, whilst there's some many, many good individual landlords, there is evidence of very poor experience in the UK of the PRS sector. Landlords who don't respond to issues, mold growing in the apartments, and they're not attended to. Really basic human needs just being ignored because it's too much effort or costs too much money. And indeed, just last week we had a major thing in the press of a newly elected MP who had half a dozen or so, had a dozen or so homes under rental, and they're in atrocious condition. So built to rent came about to provide a real alternative to that. A real alternative to that kind of, what am I going to get? The stress that's involved with, okay, I've signed a lease, but I know in 12 months' time I'm going to have to either get out because the landlord's going to hike up the rent, or what is going to happen in this time, and the security of tenure, the safety of the place, and just the stability of living creates stress on all sorts of levels. And Build to Rent recognizes this. I want to go in and say, right, here you are. We offer the apartment. We also offer other things. I mean, not everybody's got amenities all over the place. There are the higher end ones that do that, but there's mid-market solutions which are low, have a degree of low amenity in them. But at the end of the day, it's about the professional management. And I would argue that the professional management and customer centricity is the defining characteristic of Build to Rent. The second defining characteristic of Build to Rent is the need for some form of community space where the building's community can come together, have tea and cake, or do yoga, or have a homework club, whatever it may be, that there is opportunity to create some form of community. And that community is encouraged by the management or the operators, and it really all turns to having people have a good time and enjoying their stay.
How does that, because we've had some operators on the show that come from the co-living world, how do you then define between what might be a build to rent operation and a co-living where that whole community is a whole raison d'etre?
I think they're first cousins. I don't think that in principle there's anything that separates them. I think the differences come in aspects of the operational model and certainly the product itself. So in co-living, it's smaller apartments, so there's going to be a natural inclination to use more of the building. But in Build to Rent, you still rent the building. You don't just rent your apartment. So I think they're just degrees of the same model. And then in co-living, they're chasing a different demographic or type of resident who still may be long term, but due to affordability or whatever it may be, are choosing to smaller spaces. So there's the differences are wafer thin in principle. The application, of course, is a different matter. They're chasing different markets, and each of those markets will have nuanced requirements that must be attended to.
And I think that this idea of having that communal space, that big space, is also something that hotels clearly have. You know, they have a lobby and things like that. And one of the guests that we've interviewed on the show is Michael Levy, which is one of the co-founders of Citizen M. And he was talking about how their whole lobby has been designed to be basically like a living room. The way that where the kind of the cafe bid is very strategically placed. You know, it's really designed to be like a build to rent, co-living or living area.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because for many, many years when I was in purely architecture land, fortunately, there was a Citizen M around the corner from the architectural practice. And that's exactly where I took them to say, this is what build to rent is like on the ground floor. You need to create this, and then you have your apartments above that. And it was a wonderful shortcut to explaining the concept. So now we have many more examples that I don't have to rely on Citizen M, but they are a cornerstone for me personally in explaining what we mean, and they do a terrific job.
Yeah, no, 100%. And it was a good conversation with them, just seeing how the evolution of that changes. And, you know, that's kind of what we're discussing today as well, is that kind of change or shift. Maybe you can elaborate on the shift towards the service and experience model in the rental living sector. And, you know, how is this shift changing the expectations and experiences of residents?
Well, I think and again, the best source of assessing this is looking at the home view scores, for the various buildings, and they have about a pretty substantial market penetration to look at that. So, there's various things that everybody enjoys. They enjoy, as I've said, they enjoy the service, but they enjoy the predictability, the stability, the safety. They enjoy the amenities and the ability they enjoy the thoughtfulness of the proposition. That's really trying to find ways of supporting the gaps that the gaps in our lives that we need a little bit of help with. So curiously now we see in the sales market, some of the biggest sales operator looking at the same sort of extended care and really making sure that the whole process of purchase is smooth, and then even after the purchase that there is some level of support. what we're really to my mind, I mean, what I think is really happening here is that consumer culture is starting to come into residential real estate, and it's a place where perhaps we haven't always invited it to come and visit. And when we look at it from a consumer perspective, that B2C relationship is really, really important. Whereas in residential real estate, mostly it's been B2B dynamics. So there's a huge shift in valuing the customer. There's a huge shift in trying to make that process of the sale, whether it be for a whole home, if you're purchasing it, or for it's still a sale in rental terms, that you get them committed and you buy them in. And looking to provide the answers that they're looking for in a lifestyle sense. So, and again, it can be elaborate or it can be very, very simple. That consciousness, that culture of awareness of the consumer and consumer centricity, I would argue is young. It's a weird paradox. It's both young in terms of its acceptance within the market, but we have a deep knowledge of consumerism from other sectors. So we're not having to learn it from the beginning. We can bring in a mature model, but that's been accepted as necessary. That's really what is important here, that's accepted as necessary for success. 10, 15 years ago, I would never, if I suggested it to clients, we go, no, we don't need it. Why are we going to do it? Now they know they need it and they are doing it.
It's a really interesting shift that we see in so many parts of life and business, that sort of customer first. Because even in things like education or medical or whatever, you will talk about users as being clients or customers, not whatever else it might have been before. So it is that shift across everything, isn't it? That sort of customer first, the consumer centric.
No, unfortunately, when we look at our contract, I mean, again, it comes to it all comes back from history. The standard lease is an AST, and you're called a tenant, and a tenant is a legally binding, is a legal term, but it's also a very abstract term. There's no humanity in a tenant, but there is a humanity in the customer, and it's bringing this sense of humanity. We're doing this for the benefit of people. We're not doing it for horses, and so how do we create that link with them? And I suppose that brings me on to something that we've initiated in Build to Rent, certainly through the ARL, is the idea of a social contract. I mean, I would argue that hospitality they may not articulate it as a social contract, but they have one. If you go to any of the branded names, you know exactly what you can expect, and there's a standard of behavior and a standard of product. You go to an economy hotel, you know the same thing, and you know that your treatment, there will always be recourse, because they do not want the problem of reputational damage or whatever the case may be. So we've introduced a code of practice for the build to rent sector. I'm very pleased and this is our social contract. So in the context of a PRS sector, which is largely, or has an element which has created a very bad reputation for them, despite there being some very good landlords, a government that is I think suspicious of the rental sector in the round, and its credibility, and of course Build to Rent wanting to show that it is different. We've created a social contract, a code of practice that we've put out we've already published it. It's out for consultation for adoption in Q1 next year. But that's our social contract. That's what we wanted to say to society, to customers, and indeed even to government at large, and say, please judge us by these standards. And so that it doesn't matter whether you're a high-end player or a mid-market or lower market player, you can still be judged by the same standards. And so that's the cultural dimension that I think hospitality and other sectors have built up perhaps organically over many, many generations. And the consumers recognize that, and we have to fast track that now, and we have to get everybody to buy in. So there's a huge shift going on.
In hospitality, we're often at the tyranny of the review. It's the TripAdvisor, the review, the Booking.com, Expedia, whatever it is. And you mentioned home views, earlier when you were speaking. How does it work in Build to Rent in terms of that tyranny of the review?
Well, I don't think we are at tyranny yet, but it's going to come. So at the moment, I mean, there's a couple of bits to your question. There is such an imbalance of supply and demand. Demand is so huge that you really have to try hard not to rent your property, okay, even if it was made of toilet paper. So there's such a huge demand that and people are desperate for homes. So whilst in the recent home views report, we did have a little bit of a dip in some of the ratings. They were still very, very high. I think that's a product of where we are. We're 100,000 homes. We're not struggling too much to fill them. It's going to be fine. Once we double and triple that number, there will be those who are not keeping pace with the standards in the industry, if you like. And I think then we will see fluctuation in individual property reviews, but overall, I suspect the industry will still continue to score reasonably well from a ratings perspective. So the tyranny of the review, we have to start that soon. That will come, and when it comes, I'm sure it's going to be painful for the industry. But I can understand from a hospitality perspective, the voice of the consumer really can be very impactful if it's not a positive one.
Yeah, it's got a lot of weight. That's one of the first things I do is when I'm looking for a place to stay, I'm checking out the reviews, whether it's, through short-term rentals or for a hotel in a specific area, I'll go look at the reviews. And if they're not good reviews, I'm moving on, But, to go back a bit about what you're talking about in hospitality, about building brands, you go to a Citizen M, you know what you're expecting when you go into there. You know what you're going to see on the floor, you know what the rooms are going to be like. And it's all about these companies building brands. In our discovery call, we talked about, brand over buildings. So this concept suggests, a focus on brand experience over physical infrastructure. Maybe you can explain this concept just a bit further and discuss its implications both for, operators and residents in the BTR sector.
So, absolutely. So it was brand before building. Get your proposition right. Get your identify your market, and then use that to design your or to inform the design of your building. So, I read a terrific book called Brand and Other Noble Pursuits by a lady called Debbie Millman, which just changed my thinking. And it kind of looked at brands around the world, everything from the sort of Mongolian basket weaving society to Coke and McDonald's and hotel brands and so on and so forth. So it was charities, and it was just very, very revealing. But what it revealed is that actually the brand is an emotion. A brand is an emotional language that's wrapped around a product, and people trust their emotions. Our intuitive sense, and this has been borne out by neuroscience and all the therapists you want to speak to, is that certainly in the West we've lost a little bit of trust in our intuitive sense. And brand talks to that emotional part of ourselves that really wants to feel like it's being attracted or being listened to, whatever the case may be. Now, so brand before building was an attempt to say, well, is it this type of organization? What are you trying to attract, and what are you putting in there to attract those people, rather than creating a vanilla products, of which there are many, many vanilla products out there that are really so mediocre that they're at, I always say they're at the cutting edge of mediocrity, because there's just nothing to distinguish them from anything else. So brand before building was an attempt to understand what's the proposition, what's the experience you want to give to the customer, to your residents, how do you want them to feel about you? And I realized that the creation of a brand is very similar in its logic sequence to the creation of an architectural concept. Obviously it doesn't have plumbing and structural issues and all that kind of stuff. But when you're talking about the fusion of ideas and the layering of ideas onto a product, brand and architecture have many, many similarities. So when I explain this to my architecture chums, when they stop throwing stones at me, and accusing me of selling out. But the point was here is that it created a framework of understanding that it's really important that the building has a proposition that is backed up by its operation and backed up by the living experience, and that in turn will provide the not the security is the wrong word, but will assist in delivering the revenue, because it's more predictable and more manageable and all of that kind of thing. So it was an architectural insight or architectural tool that I used to explain, and Built to Rent was the perfect tool for this, because in its earlier years it was about I said probably incorrectly, acquisition and retention. It's more about drawing people in and then keeping them there, while keeping them in the building to an appropriate length, and moving them on from there. And I think now that idea is very, very, I have it repeated back to me, which is always nice. But that idea of getting that proposition correct, I think, is really accepted now in build to rent. Not always executed, but generally very well accepted and understood within the operational brief. But that brings me on to another point. Sorry, I do go on a little bit because everything links. But we're also seeing one of the reasons that brand before building didn't get traction back in the day was because we were very capex focused. It was all about capital expenditure, the cost of the build. And of course, the cost of the build is extremely important. But when you look at the operators and they kind of go, well, why did you do this? And why did you do that? And why did you create such a small storage room? Because now people are fighting with each other to get in. That's not the experience we want to present. So we're seeing the rise of the operational brief, the rise of OPEX as the dominant definer of the good experience. And some decisions in CapEx land for, say, materials or certain facilities that would normally get engineered out for cost reasons are staying in or being enhanced in the operational side, because the long-term benefit of those to the product and to the experience just speaks for itself. And at the end of the day, you're going to hold that asset for 30 years potentially. You don't want to be spending money on it too frequently to get it to perform. So there's been a whole lot of shifts in the market. We're learning as quickly as we can, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah, you've said so many really, really good things here. And one of the other things from hospitality is looking at customers' lifetime value. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here, aren't you? It's not just that one transaction of when they move in and then they'll move out. It's actually the lifetime value of the resident, but also of the building of the whole kind of brand and community. I love, I've never really thought about brand and architecture being so linked in that way, but that's a really interesting way of looking at it. I'm going to get you to repeat the book, by the way. I love a good book recommendation, so I'm going to get you to repeat that. But the other thing that you said that what I thought was, you talked about relationship building and that emotional connection, which is what brand does. But what it also does is loyalty. It creates and fosters that loyalty, which is the basis of community as well.
The book is Brand and Other Noble Pursuits by Debbie Millman. Can't remember when it was published, but it's got a blue cover. I got mine on Amazon. And you're absolutely right. So brand and community and loyalty and all those sort of things are completely interlinked. And it is in community and the integration of community, ourselves into community in an appropriate way, not a forced way, but in an appropriate way, is really what contributes to our happiness. We see that in families, and we see that in communities which are stable, and all the rest of that kind of thing. So brand is a shortcut. In simple commercial terms, I would say brand is a shortcut to the heart of your customer. And then once you've got the heart of your customer, as long as you nurture that heart, you can that's a long-term relationship. You can, when you say get them to do things, I don't mean it in that sense. I mean it that you can offer new things to them, and if they trust you, they will take that. And to your point on the lifetime elements of it, if we, I think the smart guys in hospitality and other real estate things will recognize that. As a youngster, you'll be attracted to these hotels, and as an oldster, you're going to be attracted. But if we can keep you coming back over that entire period, and we see that a lot starting to emerge in build to rent, co-living, to mainstream build to rent, to single family, and ultimately to later living, you can see that's already on the horizon. And there will be those who will have a play in each of those subsectors, because it's about providing something for the life of the residents and their customers.
No, all good stuff. I'm going to continue pushing this conversation forward because I want to get to a few other topics before we run out of time today. The next one I want to discuss with you, Brendan, is about attracting a new workforce. As the BTR sector is kind of shifting and attracting a new service-oriented workforce, what kind of skills and qualities are becoming increasingly important in this sector?
There's a level 2 and a level 4. I won't go into the technical aspects of it, but solid grounding. But there's an awful lot that's more needed on the people skills side of things, and how to deal with people and people in different situations, and all things that in, say, retail and hospitality, I suspect you would be trained on very, very early days, and and shown how to cope with things. So we have typically drawn our workforce from various places, but a lot from retail and a lot from hospitality. And unfortunately, we're not keeping them all, and they're going back because whilst they're perfectly able to handle the situation, one of the complaints that comes back, which surprised me a little bit, is, look, I've only been trained in how to keep short-term relationships. You know what I mean? If somebody comes to the desk and they're grumpy, you got to just smile at them for 20 minutes and then they're going to go away or whatever the case may be. But in build-to-rent, they keep coming back. Do you know what I mean? And they some of them from the hospitality side, weren't quite sure about all that. That kind of unnerved them a little bit. But that's for us then to provide the training for that. And certainly there's a lot of energy going into to look at that side of things at the moment. So it's certainly going to be a hot topic of the conference. We've got a special feature on the well-being of your staff rather than just the well-being of your residents. And I think that's an important distinction because that well-being is made up of education, training, facilities management, and operational dynamics. It's a full piece of work. So I think we have a little bit of a way to go. I think our workforce is under, and I mean this in a nice way, undereducated because they're not getting the support that they need from our industry at the moment. And it's a part of our industry that really needs to step up and understand the value of it, because we won't create that loyalty, that brand loyalty that we spoke about, if we don't have the people who are delivering that on the front line. So there's a lot of movement in this regard, but a little bit like it took a while for service and hospitality to become really understood, the value of that to become really understood. I suspect it will take a little bit of time for the value of highly trained individuals who are at the front end of your investment, protecting your investment. The investment in that is a very, very important investment. So we have a little bit of a way to go. I'm a little bit worried that we got a bit of time to catch up on that, but we're making progress.
Absolutely. And a couple of things sort of came to my mind. Firstly, how nice, instead of having someone talk about AI and, making sure people are skilled on that, it's actually making sure people are skilled on those soft skills, on those people skills. So that's sort of, a nice change that we're having in conversation. The other thing is that we have a sort of almost like a stereotype in the UK, because even hospitality is not seen as a career in and of itself in hospitality in the way that it might be in Europe or in the US. And I wonder whether the build to rent sector here also might suffer a little bit from that.
I think they do. I think that, one of the things we need to do is actually map out the career. So I've challenged the industry, and they have responded, not quite as I'm going to describe, but I've said I need a career path that takes me from being the janitor to the CEO.
Which happens in hotels. You'll get bellhops, front desk, do make it to CEOs in the hotel space.
But the infrastructure required to allow that to happen is there's gaps in our process. So I think there's a little bit of one of the things I want to do is I'm going to ask the industry in the coming months. I've already initiated this, although it's not public at the moment. Is like, can we standardize on terms? The description of this job and that job, so that we can start to get a handle on, this position X is worth this much money and that position Y is worth that much money, and kind of basically career mapping, landscape mapping, and then and sort of salary link to that sort of thing it's a bit haphazard at the moment, and we need to standardize that, and we'll get a common acceptance of some of these terms. Again, I say that's a reflection of where we are on our journey. And once we have those sort of standards, and once we have some of these career paths mapped out, it will be easier for us to make it attractive to those who are not part of the industry, and also describing what those roles entail. So we do need to bring technology into this now. Build to rent is going to have a high tech dimension to it, as all industries I think going forward will. But I think in terms of residential real estate, the living sector, we will have much higher tech deployment than residential sales. For the younger generations, the use of tech and the ability to advance through tech is part of what will make any career attractive to them in many respects. I don't mean to generalize, but we have to be clear on the tech we're using and how we're deploying it. Even AI, which is going to be commonly used in the industry and is already, but that's going to increase and be adept at absorbing these new initiatives or these new products and services and showing how we deploy them in a thoughtful, considered, and responsible way. So the career path, it's quite interesting. My daughter's just graduated university. I'm trying to encourage her into the build to rent world, and she's asked me these questions like, well, where do I start, and do I need to know about buildings, and what does this mean, and I'm like going, I'll have to get you to talk to a few people. So it's not described, but that only means there's an opportunity to describe it and get that process going.
Yeah, really interesting. And the association is going to do that. It's going to lead on mapping that out, or
so my job, I mean, if the members ask me to do that, I will do that. So I do come up with my own ideas and I set the agenda, or I influence the agenda to some extent, but really the Association of Rental Living is led by its members. So whatever's at the coal face for them, we have a simple mantra of action, not words. So every time we have a public event that's got our name on it, everybody has to come up with 3 action points for the industry that I will take on and put into one of our initiatives. So the need for wider education, softer skills education, and to create the marketing platform to attract people in, that's already in train. It needs a bit of a boost, if I'm honest. It needs to be resourced. Then on the other side, the technology is equal to that. That is sometimes a little bit easier to deploy, but then if it's not thought through with all the other tech, it can create problems as well. So it's not a panacea, that's for sure. But fundamentally, what we're really talking about is holism and looking at the various, really to understand the value parameters of each of these components and make sure that we nurture all of them appropriately. And we spent 10 years getting the money sorted out in terms of getting the investment case and how that works. We've worked hard on getting the product right, and that's now moving in the right direction. And now we have to get the not so much the customer right, but our people right. Yeah, that's the future, sort of as I see it from that perspective.
Brendan, you mentioned how the US is sort of much further ahead than the UK. Can you tell us a little bit more about those comparisons and how the UK built to rent sector can really learn from the US? Like, what is the US doing that we're not yet currently doing?
The answer is a lot, and I think we're at a point where we can learn an awful lot from them, but we're also learning that they can learn a little bit from us. So I just want to go back in history for a little bit. So the National Apartments Association, which is obviously a huge part of the build-to-rent economy or the multifamily economy in the States, kind of sponsored us as a affiliate to their organization 10 or 12 years ago. I forget the date exactly. And that's why we were called the UKAA, to show our association with the States and that we were learning from that very deep source of knowledge and bringing that to the UK. So the US will always be ahead of us in many respects, and there is an active dialogue and dynamic between us and the NAA, which we will maintain despite our name change. We did it with their blessings, and we want to maintain that closeness. There's no question. But from a perspective of differences or similarities, I think in some areas we're deploying tech more effectively and more efficiently and more adventurously than they are in the States. I think that some of the guys who come from the States and look at our product see a better quality of finish and a quality of presentation overall. So we're sort of sending a quality agenda back to the States, and we're sending maybe applied tech back to them. Not all of the operational tech, which often is American, but some of the other tech that we've deployed within the spaces. But we've seen single family homes become a major part of build to rent, but that sort of low rise, probably slightly longer term rentals with many more families involved, that's really been going here in the UK for only 2 or 3 years. That's going to get very big. The main reason for that is we have a much more mature supply chain of house builders who will be able to supply that for us as additional homes to the homes they would already be developing for sale. So it's very clear, it's very important to us that everybody understands it's about additionality, not replacement. In terms of other trends coming forward, I mean, I keep an eye on the news as best I can, but there seems to be I've been involved with various things around staffing and getting the staffing culture right and getting that operational piece going. Huge amounts to learn from that. We can learn from the States on almost every level, but the most important thing that's going to help us in the UK is understanding how to keep operational efficiency at good, efficient levels while still being able to provide a very good service. So operational costs, gross to net, that sort of thing. We're still working towards getting those benchmarks sorted out, where those benchmarks have existed for a great deal of time in the States. They don't compare directly because we're offering slightly different things and not all the points sort of really align. But the principles of that operational benchmarking that I know is much more mature in the States is where we have to get to. And we have a very initiative that we're working on right now that is slowly getting support on that point. So there's sort of softer things that we could look at, but the real hard things that we need that we would need to learn or still need to learn from the States is that operational expenditure, how to get that management model really, really working well. We can always learn something on customer care. That's never ending. I think our product has evolved to be something very UK appropriate. And we shift some of those ideas backwards, but there's an awful lot of foundational work still to be done, and we look to the States mostly to help us with that.
And I guess that the US also just has that sheer scale that we don't have in the UK. But Brendan, do you know what? I think we probably should leave that for another Pillow Talk sessions. It's a big topic. Thank you so much for joining us today on this Pillow Talk Sessions episode, and we do hope to have you again another time.
No, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
And that wraps it up for us today. A big thank you for joining us on this episode of Pillow Talk Sessions. Of course, a huge thank you to Brendan for such an engaging conversation and for sharing his perspective on the fascinating convergence between hospitality and the build-to-rent sectors. To stay connected and catch every new episode, do us a favor and head over to pillowtalksessions.com to subscribe. And be sure to follow us on LinkedIn for more insights and interviews with leaders who are shaping the future of hospitality, multifamily living, and community-driven spaces. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Pillow Talk Sessions.